Welcome to r/entitled people, where we share stories from your lives about people who think the rules don't apply to them, and they should get what they want. Thank you, friends, for subscribing to the channel, and for so many likes. And today we have one great story, so subscribe, hit the like button, and let's begin. And today's first story is EP asks family to disregard their father's dying wish to save his own reputation. On to the story. EP equals entitled pastor? Yep. My mom was the volunteer secretary for our church practically since this congregation was formed back in the early 1960s. She served under 5 different pastors over the years, and all of them depended on her a great deal. She knew everyone in the church, and everyone knew her. My dad had served as the church president several different terms, was a church elder, belonged to every committee and group he was eligible for, and knew everyone, and everyone knew him. Let's just say that anytime anyone had a question about where something was, or how something was done within the church, our phone rang. The church was our family. One of my mom's main responsibilities of her job was producing the weekly church bulletin. This required getting a few bits of information from the pastor, mainly his sermon title and which hymns would be sung that week. Back in the day, she would do this by using a hand-cranked mimeograph machine. Google it, kids. It wasn't quite having to chisel it into a stone tablet, but close. Being the perfectionist she was, there were many times when she would find a mistake in the stencil, and rather than leave it, she'd retype the whole thing on her manual typewriter, even though there wasn't one church member who would have cared if service was spelled service. Sadly, my mom passed away following a short illness in 1996. Her sudden departure left a major hole in the church's day-to-day operations. I was grieving badly, not only because I'd lost my mother, but because she was my best friend. About the second Sunday after my mom's funeral, our current pastor stood in front of the congregation at the end of the service and asked if there were any volunteers willing to help to try to keep the office going, and in particular, would someone like to volunteer to produce the weekly bulletin? This was now the second week there was no bulletin. I'm guessing it was my grief that made me do it, but I slowly raised my hand. Already having a full-time job and 2 kids under 4 would make this difficult, but I felt confident that I could do it. Now, this current pastor had been with this congregation for about 19 years at this point. I was in the first confirmation class he taught during his first year. He officiated my wedding. We knew each other well. At first, he was very accommodating to my schedule and worked with me to make sure I had any information I needed and plenty of time to get things done. However, as time went by, a couple of months, he started to become lax about providing sermon titles and hymn choices in a timely manner. I began to often find myself at the church late on Saturday evenings typing up the bulletin for Sunday morning. Now all done on a computer, thank you very much. And each time I would find a way to remind him that it would help me a lot if he would have this info available a day or 2 earlier, so I wasn't having to scramble to get this done so close to the deadline. He'd do better for a week or 2, but then it would get right back to the last-minute crap. There are many other things he would do that annoyed me, all of them entitled behaviors, but those are for another post. Now, my dad was a real character. He had a biting, sarcastic sense of humor, and you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone that would say a bad word against him. He could also be very opinionated and loved a good debate. For example, he loved when a Jehovah's Witness person would come to the door. He'd invite them in, pull out his Bible, and start arguing with them to show proof about this or that. I doubt he ever converted any of them, but I'm positive there were 1 or 2 that left there slightly questioning what they thought they knew. So my dad's relationship with the current pastor was very good. He considered him a good friend, as well as his spiritual leader, even though they had some heated debates through the years. The majority stemming from the pastor's sense of entitlement whenever he requested a raise in salary, or when he'd start talking about needing to hire an associate pastor because there was just too much for him to do. Being in the positions he had, Dad would tell me that our pastor was already the highest paid in the region, with the smallest congregation. Again, there are many more entitled stories I could tell about this pastor, but let me get to this story. Let's finally meet the cast for this story. EP, entitled pastor. Me is me. D is dad. OB is my older brother. It's now 1999, and my dad has cancer and is in a hospice facility. I'm seeing a great new guy that Dad really likes, and he knows that new guy and I are already planning on getting married, even though we're not yet officially engaged. I had even told EP that New Guy and I were planning on marrying, to which he replied that before he would marry us, we would need to attend his pre-marriage classes. New Guy and I weren't really thrilled about this, but we went ahead and scheduled the first class for the third Thursday in September. It's now the end of August and my dad's health was taking a bad turn. I was there on a Saturday afternoon, and Dad and I began talking about New Guy and I getting married, and how even though I knew Dad wouldn't be able to walk me down the aisle, I really wanted him to be there. He just looked at me and said, "You'd better hurry then." I gave him a kiss, promised him I would, and burst into tears the moment I got home, telling New Guy I was afraid there was no way my dad would make it until the wedding. New Guy just wiped away my tears and said he would make sure my dad would see us get married. Suddenly, we're planning a wedding to be held at the hospice facility on Wednesday evening, just 4 days away. New Guy went into mad planning mode. We divided the tasks that needed to get done, so it would be more like a real wedding event, and not just the pastor and us in my dad's hospice room. We invited a few family members. I bought a dress, just an off-white lace short dress, not a full bridal gown, and I called EP to let him know what was happening. Here's how the conversation went. Me: "Hey, EP, sorry I missed service this morning. Dad took a bad turn last evening and I didn't get home until very late, so I overslept and woke up an hour late. Hopefully one of the church elders found the bulletins okay?" EP: "Yes, no problem. Have you talked to Dad today? How's he doing?" Me: "Not yet. New Guy and I are getting ready to head over to the hospice now. So by the way, New Guy and I have decided to get married ASAP so that Dad can be a part of it. We're planning it for Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. EP: "I'm sorry, I won't be able to do that." Being the church secretary, I had access to his calendar, and even though he had a district minister's meeting on Wednesday night, I knew he'd skip this meeting for just about any reason he could find in the past. So when he said he couldn't marry us, I assumed he was saying this because of this meeting. So I started laughing because I was sure he was joking. EP: "What's so funny?" Me: "Okay, yeah, because you've never missed that district meeting before." EP: "It has nothing to do with the district meeting." Me, beginning to realize that he wasn't joking. "Okay, then what's up?" EP: "You guys haven't taken my classes yet." Me: "Are you serious? Yes, I know we haven't taken them yet, but we've already scheduled them, and still plan on taking them, but my dad is not likely to live much longer, and I want him to be a part of me marrying New Guy, so I was assuming you'd be willing to go ahead with the ceremony, given the extenuating circumstances." EP: "I'm sorry, but no, I won't marry you until you take the classes." Just to clarify, there were 4 classes, each one about an hour and a half. Considering that New Guy and I still had to work our regular jobs, there was simply no way we could take the classes before Wednesday evening, even if we wanted to. After a few more minutes of me trying to persuade EP to change his mind and finally giving up, we hung up. I burst into tears, sobbing uncontrollably. New Guy rushes into the room panicked, asking what's wrong. Between sobs, I slowly managed to tell him about my conversation with EP and started crying harder again, because I assume that this means we won't be able to get married in time for my dad to see it. New Guy will have none of this nonsense and suggests I call my brother. Me: "OB? About the wedding on Wednesday?" I slowly explain what's happened, trying unsuccessfully to not start sobbing again. "Do you think there's any way your pastor would be able to marry us?" OB: "I'll call him right away and find out. My guess is he'll be more than happy to help. I'll call you right back." OB never could stand to hear his baby sister crying. He calls back less than 10 minutes later and tells me that his pastor said he would absolutely do it. He had a meeting scheduled. Same meeting that EP usually skips, but said it was no problem to miss it. It's now Monday evening, and I'm visiting my dad at hospice. I tell him that New Guy and I are getting married on Wednesday evening, and then mention that EP is not doing the ceremony. He asked why, and I gave a quick answer about the classes and laughed it off. He got a stern look on his face, but didn't say anything more about it. Now, this next part took place after I left that evening, but OB relayed the conversation to me in great detail, so here it goes. D: "OB, I have something very important to tell you, and I'm being completely serious." OB, shaken because D's tone is very unusual. "Okay, what's up?" D: "When I die, I don't want EP to have anything to do with my funeral. Absolutely nothing. You handle it however you need to, as long as EB does not participate in any way." OB: "Okay, whatever you say. I understand." OB went on to reassure D that his pastor was stepping in and everything would be handled. Before he left for that evening, D, in a much weaker tone because his pain meds were kicking in, told OB again that EP could have nothing to do with his funeral service, period. OB again reassured him that he would see to it. OB immediately called me when he got home and told me what D had said. We kinda chuckled at D getting the last word in this final debate with EP, but I felt a bit guilty that their friendship was basically over because of me. I had a brief conversation with D about it on Tuesday evening, but not much of one because his condition was worsening, and his pain meds were being administered at higher doses, so he was more out of it than in. So Wednesday night comes, the weather was unseasonably gorgeous, and we were even able to hold the ceremony on the little patio right outside Dee's room, rolling his bed onto the patio. His eyes were closed for the majority of the time, so I wasn't sure he was really aware of what was going on, but when the pastor asked us to all join in the Lord's Prayer, Dee's lips were moving as he recited every word. He perked up for a few minutes after the ceremony, and he and I talked for a few seconds. He thanked me for making sure he was included, told me he loved me, and he was glad new guy would be around to take care of me. I told him I loved him too. It was a bittersweet moment, and the last words we would speak to each other. My dad passed away 3 days later. I didn't go to see him because new guy and I both got sick, and when I called to try to talk to him, the hospice nurse told me that he was sleeping and pretty heavily medicated now. New guy had planned a short weekend trip for he and I, along with my 2 children, to go to a state park in a neighboring state and stay in a cabin. Not really a honeymoon, but at least a little getaway to celebrate our getting married. Unfortunately, we only stayed Friday night. I got the call from OB on Saturday morning that Dee had passed away, so he headed right back. During our drive back, OB got a call from EP, saying he'd heard that Dee was gone. He proceeded to tell OB that he thought the funeral service should be scheduled for Monday, and asked him to call the funeral home to make the arrangements accordingly. Here's how that conversation went, and where the most disgusting display of entitlement happens. OB: sorry EP, but we won't be having the church service at insert church name here, and you won't be officiating at the graveside funeral service either. EP: what? What do you mean? OP: D was very clear that he wanted you to have absolutely nothing to do with any of it. EP: why would he say that? OB: when my sister told him of your refusing to marry her and new guy because they haven't yet taken your classes, he decided he wanted nothing more to do with you. EP: oh, that's not what I said. Your sister misunderstood me. I had a very important meeting for Wednesday night. Since this was planned so last minute, I just couldn't change my plans. I'm sure if he knew. OB totally cutting him off. You mean the same meeting my church's pastor was scheduled to attend, but skipped to perform the ceremony? The same meeting you've skipped more times than you've attended? You mean the meeting that you in fact did not attend anyway? OB later told me he didn't really know that for sure, but bluffed and was actually right. He never did go. EP after stammering for a few seconds. Well, I think you should still have everything here at Dee's church. The rest of the congregation won't understand if you don't let me do it, and it's not held here. OB: so you're asking me to go against my dad's dying wish? One he was very specific about? EP: yes, he was probably just so medicated that he didn't really understand what he was saying. OB: oh no, he was extremely lucid, and I asked him several times just to be sure. He said no. EP: but the other members of the congregation won't get a chance to pay their last respects. OB: again, are you seriously asking me to disregard his dying wish? Believe me, we'll make sure everyone knows exactly what's going on, he said very emphatically. Besides, you knew the man well. Would you really want to have him haunting you from the grave for disobeying his wish? I know I don't, and I won't have to worry about it because this discussion is over. OB's pastor officiated the funeral service at the funeral home and the graveside service. The funeral home was packed to capacity with all the members of the congregation in attendance. I resigned from being the church secretary the day after the funeral. There was no way I could work with EP at that point. I transferred my church membership to another church in my town a couple months later and never set foot in what had been the only church I had ever known again. I heard that EP requested to be moved to another church in his home state a few months later. Seems he had lost the respect of most of the congregation. I've had several calls from members of that congregation telling me that EP was gone and asking me to come back. Not to be secretary, just come back to us. I told them I would think about it, but I haven't gone back since. Just too many bad feelings for me there. I hope you enjoyed the video. Hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications.